What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Tonight in the shop, we've got Jake from East Coast Polishing.
What's up, guys?
And he's gonna be giving me some polishing lessons tonight. So I have dabbled in polishing before, but it has been years and years, and I'm really excited to learn some new stuff tonight. So I think we're gonna get right into it.
All right, so today we're gonna be training Lacey on these 26x16 Recon JTX wheels. We ended up going over to JTX's main facility today and picking these up. These are gonna be kind of a joint project between me and Zach and Lacey. I'm doing the full polishing process. We're gonna get Lacey trained up on polishing, so if she ever needs it, she can use it. And on top of that, they're gonna be powder coating these for my SEMA build, the fully polished Alumaduty truck. So right here, we actually have a homemade wheel jig. I seem to get a lot of questions on this device here. This is simply just a lathe chuck head that spins on a trailer spindle attached to a jack with a base. It's a very simple device. They can be bought off of some websites, but this one itself is actually homemade from me. And this is kind of what I use to polish and where I make my magic happen. As a professional, it just makes the process easier and quicker for us, as you're gonna see us do as we complete the polishing process.
This process is always interesting when there's no tire.
Then I toss 2 lug nuts in here, which I didn't grab my impact for, my mistake. And then I zip in the lug nuts. She'll be tight up there, stay nice and locked. I tend to use the actual wheel spacer because it lets the wheel lock on without me screwing up. There's like a center bore in here. I typically don't like to put the teeth mark in there. I find it a little more efficient to just send the lug nuts. Holds it right tight. So probably the hardest thing of polishing is figuring out where to start with sanding, how to start prepping. And prep is probably the biggest aspect of polishing. If your prep isn't good, your polish isn't gonna be good. It's no different than what Lacey and Zach experienced with powder. If your prep isn't good, your powder's not gonna stick, and end of the day, your product's not gonna be good. So for us, you kind of have to examine it. If you have heavier pitting, really the lowest grit I recommend for someone starting out and learning is gonna be your 320 grit. When you get into that 220, 180, 120, the lowest I ever go is 120. It's really tough to get those grits worked out of the aluminum. So something like this, I like to tell people start with 320 at your lowest. Something like this though, I'm looking at this grit here, and to me, I'm saying that's more of like a 320 grit already on the wheel. So after playing with my face just a little bit, because that's kind of a more intricate area, for the barrel, I think we're gonna start out with 600 grit for Lacey to start with. My paper that I'm usually using is the Hermes when I get to a 600 grit. Anything like 320 and below that, I use the Renegade Savage discs. Those seem to work just a little bit better for me. They're a ceramic sandpaper and they seem to have just a little bit more grit and a kick to them. When you get into the finer grits like 600 and 800, your Hermes disc seems to just perform a little bit better. They're a little bit softer, and the buff seems to just cut them out a little bit easier than the ceramic discs. So with this, I'm gonna be using a palm sander DA. I like to use one of these foam interface pads on here. You can see on my DA, I typically run 3/4 inch thick foam pad. These are anywhere on Amazon, Renegade makes them. There's a lot of people that sell these foam pads. It's kind of hit or miss, whatever you want. So you could do a 1/2 inch or 3/4. I like the 3/4. They seem to have a little more flex to them for a barrel. That way you're getting full contact area out of your sandpaper, versus if you use just the hard backer, you're only gonna be using the edges of the paper. As you're stepping up in grits, you're gonna actually start finding reflection out of your sanding. So when I'm looking at this, I'm saying this is 320. The reason being is when I look at this with my own eye, and it's something that you're kind of gonna develop the more you polish, is the actual reflection factor out of the sanding. When I have 180, there's virtually no reflection at all. 320, I get just the slightest bit. And when I'm putting my fingers to this wheel, I'm seeing the slightest bit of reflection, so I know this is a good 320. Once Lacey finishes running the 600 grit, which you're gonna be running in usually I run these at full speed, however fast your palm sander will go, and you're gonna use a medium pressure just to kind of compress that foam a little bit to take shape to the wheel. And all you're doing is just running small sections back and forth, very consistent, all the way from your outside edge to your inside edge. And we're just gonna go back and forth in these areas, and eventually you're gonna start to see some kind of real nice reflection coming from 600, and when you get to 800, the reflection gets even better. The more reflection you have, the better you're gonna cut. That means you're at a thorough, good 600 or 800. Either or grit you can cut from. We're gonna see what our 600 does for a reflection on this, and then I'll make the decision if we wanna go all the way to 800 or if we're gonna stay just at 600 before we cut. Anyways, we're gonna get Lacey started on this process here. For most beginners, I do recommend wearing gloves and a mask just for safety precautions. Breathing in any kind of dust is not good for you.
That's for all the OSHA people in the comments. We know there's gonna be some.
So when you're using an orbital, you're always gonna see, I kind of start at this outside edge here, and I do a small section passes of back and forth, and it's almost like buffing paint. And then I'm gonna come up here and I'm gonna overlap that just a little bit. Oh, okay. And then I might do one big section and then I'll rotate just a little bit. The pressure is usually light enough where I can just use kind of one hand on it, but let me show you. So we're at orbital here. When you remove this dust here, you can just feel how smooth it is. And you're starting to see some real reflection out of that. You can see my hand. That's a pretty good 600. When you get over here, where I'm guessing this is 320, you really don't have any reflection. So you're starting to see how much better it gets. Like right here was a really good one. And at least from my angle here, you can kind of see some squigglies up here. They look like little dots. That's still that previous grit. Down here, from what I'm seeing, there's really not much for little dots. There's still some. The perfect angle, you can pick them up. And the goal is just working those.
Yeah, so that would be the part you go over again with this section.
Exactly. So now I'd rotate here and I'd kind of start overlapping. Sometimes I'll lock a foot in on a jig on both sides, use both my ankles on it, or really anything. If you wanted to, we could wrap a microfiber and duct tape on your ankle, whatever you want. Jigs are tough because finding a break with them is always hard. That's why my next jig,
I'm gonna try the one hand like you did. If there's anything I'm doing absolutely wrong, just tap me on the shoulder and I'll stop.
Of course.
Is that good so far?
So the only thing I'd recommend is just slowing down a little bit. You slow down just a little more pressure. That way the sandpaper can really do the work.
Okay.
And if you look at that pad, you're starting to see how it's starting to build up all the silver in the center. That means that pad's just about done. When the center starts building, that's when it's not going to cut as well. So usually then I'll replace them. Any of those white Hermes pads or anything, they don't seem to last as long as the ceramic pads do. That's why the ceramic pads, we love them in the heavy grits because they just never die. Those ones, I go through a lot of them. So don't be afraid to toss a new one on there.
Perfect.
And pressure kind of helps too. With the gloves, you might not be able to get it off there because the Velcro likes to come up too. Perfect.
There you go.
Pressure sometimes helps pads last a little bit longer. Sometimes the speed too will keep them from caking up. Sometimes too, if you have like dirty pants, you can run the pad real quick on your pants. It'll discharge it. You can get a little more life out of it. But typically once they cake up, they're pretty much done. So just slow down, a little more pressure, nice slow back and forth, letting that sandpaper do the work.
Okay. Is that looking better?
For sure. Yeah, so you're starting to see that reflection coming out of there. Out here in the center, you can really see my hand. If you look at my fingertips, that's what I look for. When that reflection's starting to come, you know you're getting a much better sand. Every once in a while you'll get these tough spots. That's from kind of leaning the sander a little bit. So it's more about just keeping that center pressure. It is really difficult to not get those marks. Typically, they don't really affect your polish too much. Every once in a while you'll be cutting, and if those are there, you might have to kind of slow down to work those a little bit extra. It's really just a personal preference and something that just comes in really time.
So would you say like this section right here, if I can work those out, this section should be done probably with this grid anyways?
Yeah. So it's just keeping a smooth hand and kind of really being able to go with the barrel, which is difficult. Sometimes it's round, so it's really easy to just kind of tense your wrist up right here. It's really about just keeping it round the whole way through.
Am I making this worse or is that normal?
No, that's totally normal. So that's what happens when the pad just starts getting caked a little bit.
Okay.
So it's starting to get that center. You can start seeing that ring coming out. It's really not bad though.
But that's just kind of on the part we haven't really sanded yet, right?
Yep.
Or
yeah.
Okay. It's like this section's looking pretty good.
Yeah. Now I'd toss on a fresh pad.
And then kind of move to like here to here probably.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
If you're good, 2 seconds, I'm just gonna rip some 320 through that just to make sure we're at 320. That way it's just easy to do with 600. Because that could be 180. It looks like it's struggling to come out in some little spots. Again, if I started with a polished wheel, I would know exactly where to start, but someone already prepped it. So working off of someone else's prep work can be a little iffy, but 320 you can pretty proficiently pull 180 even with 320. So 320 is really my weapon of choice to work out anyone's sanding stuff, unless maybe they were using like 80 grit or something like that. 80 grit's a grit that I just never recommend on any type of polished aluminum. So, poor teacher move on my end. I ended up having Lacey trying to work 180 with 600. Not the greatest start to our day. But anyways, we ended up ripping this with some 320 on a DA real quick just to get it where it needs to be. So now you can really tell the difference between this 320, which has a decent amount of reflection. When you start really putting your fingers on it, right there you can slightly see my finger's reflection. When we come over to something like 600, you're starting to see my whole finger. You're starting to really see some. It's tough to see with the shadows. Polishing at night is not always ideal in LED. Sunlight's definitely the best way to polish, but out here in the heat of Texas, we're working with what we got. So anyways, we're gonna have Lacey come back over here, and now she's gonna see how quickly and simple she can start matching this kind of finish's color with this 320 here. Usually it's a pretty good breeze to move through it. It's not a process that takes 2 seconds, but it shouldn't take you all day to just do a simple 600 over 320. You definitely have to take your time and be thorough, but it doesn't take hours with a single grit unless you're starting from square one.
What do I need to do better to avoid that kind of thing?
So there's a couple things you can do. Since we have a jig here, it's pretty easy where you could work your whole section. If you saw me when I was sanding, I would actually hold the sander in one spot stationary. I'd work it back and forth so that there's no working on tilting your hand with it. The biggest reasoning for that is really just the tilt of the hand against. So to kind of prevent that and make it really easy, what I did, if you watch, I pin it in one spot. Also with that, to make it easier for yourself, every sander is a little different, but this one, when you turn it on, you can push this button, and then you can just hold it by the head.
Oh, okay.
And it's a lot easier to hold your angle than back here on this handle is kind of tough.
That makes sense.
I do have another sander. If this one keeps getting in trouble, I have one that's literally just the head, and it's a button you switch. That one's sometimes easier, but I'm not a big fan of the Dewalt ones. For some reason, I really love this Makita. It just has more power, it feels. But anyways, sometimes I'll hold it, and I'll just move the wheel back and forth between my areas, and then I move to a new section and go. If that's not easy for you, it really comes down to that wrist tilt. And end of the day too, it's not the end of the world that those are there. They don't really affect much. You might just slow down a little bit on those spots to work on cutting them, but they should cut right out.
Is that better or worse?
I think it looks better. It looks good.
Or is that?
No, it looks good.
Okay.
That's just the pores kind of sometimes will close and open. That's one thing about aluminum.
It's just normal.
A lot of people understand the pores. Like if you go over an area for a long, long period of time, your reflection will start to die from the pores closing. That's why we stop at 800 grit. And if you go to 1,000 or something like that, it's actually kind of harder to pull a shine out of aluminum with those really high grits.
I don't mind this one, but
That free spin sucks.
yeah, we can swap them.
Those Makitas, they like to they'll just spin, and then when you put it in, it's always like, damn, you make all these marks, then you keep going over it to get rid of them, and it just gets frustrating. These Dewalts, generally they don't free spin. Sometimes they do. It's all about the rubber bands.
I just haven't done this part, right?
So looking at that, we started at the valve stem. So one of my tricks I always do is I start at valve stem.
That's smart. So I think I still have this section to do,
Exactly.
right? How is that looking so far?
That looks damn good to me. I'm seeing reflection out of that. It's not super strong, but it's there. I can see my pinky. That's what I'm looking for right now. I see my pinky in there. That's pretty good. When we run our 800, that's going to clean up a lot too. We're probably going to run 800 over this.
So I'll probably switch a new pad and do that section.
So just look for that valve stem. That's when your ending point is. That's like the one thing I pick on every wheel is valve stem.
Does that look good to move on to the next grit?
For me, hell yeah. The reason I'm saying that is from here, I'm seeing the reflection of all the spokes in it 320, you're not gonna get a lot of reflection, but when I'm looking back here, I see some really good reflection out of those spokes, almost like it's a decent polished wheel. So to me now, we're gonna pick up some 800 grit, which is gonna be that brown box right there. 800 is gonna be the same thing, but honestly, you can move a little bit faster. If there's a little bit of 600 residue left, it's really not that big a deal, it cuts. So with that, I'm almost gonna set the sander on it. I'm gonna pick my valve stem there, and I'm just gonna kind of really slowly spin the wheel and just let it sit kind of on a high edge and let that 800 just eat. I'll go over it once I see that valve stem. I'll move in just a little bit so it's still overlapping. Keep spinning. See that valve stem again, move in, move in, move in. Get to my valve stem. Then I'll usually toss a fresh pad on. So we're starting fresh, start at the valve stem, and I'll just do the same rotation, and every time I see it, I come out just a little bit to get to your outside. Then after that, we're gonna run our lips. The lip is out at 320. And the reason I do the lip last is because we're gonna take that interface pad off, and to not ruin those, I try to not take them on and off, on and off, on and off. I get my barrel done, then I'll do my lips.
Perfect.
Go just a little bit slower.
Slower?
And a little
Should I
more pressure.
go again?
Oh, you're gonna start with your outside in. Just go outside in now.
With a new pad or no?
Yeah, I'd toss a new pad
Okay.
on. Outside in, just a little bit slower and just a little more pressure.
Does that look okay for the 800?
Perfect. That's a perfect 800. So now we're gonna be pulling that interface pad off there. I grab that foam, we're gonna pull that right off. The reason I'm pulling that interface pad off is it's soft and it gives. A lot of people don't care. Me, I'm super specific with these lips. These lips, and these are a brand new wheel, I don't wanna round these lips out. And when you take a really soft pad, especially on something called rotary sanding, this is DA, so we don't take a lot of material fast. Rotary sand will remove material really fast. So we're gonna use a flat, hard backer. Even with a rotary sander DA, I like that nice hard back so that we can maintain the shape and form of this flat edge. Any kind of flat metal, I typically on a DA won't run an interface pad. If I was doing anything with round, I'm always using an interface pad. Anything with rotary, interface pad, other than this process. Lips, we just don't ever want to knock down the sharpness of the edge or maybe get in these letters and kind of deform them. So to keep that shape, I like that nice hard back, but every artist that's a polisher is a little bit different. That's just my personal preference. So with this is out at 320 right now. We're gonna pick up some of that 600 in one pad. You should be able to do it. The hardest thing is really holding this wheel still and being consistent on it. For me, I'll kind of do sometimes in the top here or side, wherever it really feels comfortable for you to hold that and be able to hold the wheel. And I'll just do like a little 5-inch section, and then I'll move in a 5-inch section. You're not gonna really see reflection out of this just because it's such a small area. You can see they also sanded this top edge here on here, so we're gonna run that real light. You're just gonna put pressure here, and you're just gonna run it. I personally know on these wheels where the tires are sitting, and I know that this lip isn't gonna show at all, other than maybe the top edge of that. So we are gonna polish this lip, but we're not gonna go too crazy with it. I'll probably just do a general cut on this and maybe some finisher because that's a very hidden part. If you were running a very stretched tire and you know someone's tire is gonna be very stretched, this lip is super important to make sure you get all the way around front and back because it is seen. So it's very important to know what your customers plan to do for a tire setup. Obviously, given if you're doing this professionally and as a business, you always want to overlap that lip. But if you personally know where your tire is and they're your wheels, obviously do whatever you know is going to be the most time efficient. DA is actually the palm sander she's using. That's kind of like the vibrating sander. There's 3 different types of sanding. You have orbital, which is kind of like a paint buffer, and that's where the head random orbits out and comes back, and it also kind of has that vibrating sense to it. The DA really has a slight spin to it, and it just vibrates in one spot. And then you have rotary. Rotary is the most aggressive type of sanding we do in polishing, and that's actually using a physical grinder that we use that's variable speed, or maybe like the Dewalt Inox is the very hot orbital tool that pretty much every professional is kind of adapted to now, and that just spins as a head, and that's what's going to remove material extremely fast. And for beginners, I kind of shy them away from it, for the simple reason being it's so easy to deform the aluminum or maybe hold it down in a spot just too long, or it creates a divot in the aluminum. So the DA is really the safest route for someone who doesn't do this as a daily practice.
should I have hit like this corner better when I had the pad on?
Yep. So you actually just pointed out something that as you started, I realized. So you don't really need the pad on for this edge here, but this rolling edge is a spot that really likes to hold sand marks. This edge and this edge here, this belly, loves to hold sand marks, and I see a lot of polishers that are new, they're always struggling to get sand marks out of there. With the grinder, I have a really simple trick to get them out of here easily and here easily, but with that sander, I'm gonna take that from you real quick. One thing I'll commonly do is I'll kind of just set it in here on this angle. Even if you don't have an interface pad, it's not a big deal. You're gonna see I kind of put quite a bit of pressure here because I want that 600 to really cut this deep and really be in there. When we run our 800, it's gonna be a lot lighter on it. But we're gonna come in and just roll it like this, kick it on. As I'm doing that, you can actually physically see the sander, if you were watching here, kicking material off and dropping it in the wheel. That's how you know that 600 is really eating on that. Sometimes even when I do these edges, if I have a jig, it's real easy to just stand here, put pressure on it, and just... You can actually see the material getting pulled off, little bit of dust. And then I'll just come up, kick it on top, nice and flat. See that material getting kicked off. We know we're removing material. And then maybe for courtesy, we'll kick it inward just a little bit. When it's spinning the way you had it, it is doing its job, but sometimes they're really light and you're skipping that 320. When I do it, you're gonna notice that it spins, but it's not quite that free spinning motion.
Where you're standing is a good...
And also where I'm standing helps sometimes too. Typically I do it sitting down, but sometimes I'm in a rush, I stand up and I just do it. So I'm kind of used to all of it just because I get put in so many different situations.
Maybe I need to like go more to the corner and like put more
Sometimes
weight
I'll
on
sit
it.
on the edges, sometimes I'll sit in front. Like I said, it's whatever feels uniform and comfortable for you. I like doing the spinning motion when I do this just because it's so easy to keep the form of it. Then when I'm sitting here in one spot and I'm just trying to work it and it's locked in one place, it's really easy to kind of add that light little divot. And when you're polishing stuff, the slightest little imperfection in the metal, your eyes are gonna pick up because that reflection just stands out better than black paint on a truck. So now after the 600, we'll do 800. If you wanna try the standing technique, you can, sitting on an angle, whatever feels comfortable.
Good with the 600 or?
I would toss some 800 just to make it easy for yourself. We're good with this 600 though.
Is that okay for the back side or should I go more?
Yeah, there's 600 into it. So as long as there's that 600 there, you can cut it. The 800 really just makes it so it cuts just that little bit easier. So here we got some different tools. Right here, my grinder of choice is more of a professional grade of the Dewalts. I use the 849X Dewalt grinder. That's my variable speed of choice for the simple reason it hits 3,500 RPMs versus the Makita. You'll see a lot of professionals using. Those only go to 32. I like to run the handle. It's a great safety precaution. My grip is usually my thumb and then my hand here. Whenever I'm doing the cutting process, I'm always maxed out. 3,500 RPMs, no choice. For our buff of choice, I'm a big fan of these newer ones. We just released these. These are a red and pink buff. The inside is pink, the outside is red. It's a blended buff. This is actually a 20 ply, so it's a little bit thicker than the average 16 ply buff you're gonna find on the market. And me, I'm always, for some reason, running a centerless buff. I feel like it's a lot safer. These are called safety flanges. I've gone over these in a lot of my content videos. These are meant to grip these prongs. Every buff you use has teeth. These teeth are what hold the fabric to the center ring, which is what attaches to the buff. As a safety precaution, I like these flanges. A, they're quicker to get on and off. B, they're just safer. And for doing this every single day, safety is kind of a big deal. So I like to spin these on, then I'll pop my button on the back. Little snug tight, you don't have to wrap on it. After that, our most important tool that a lot of people have failed to know is something called a rake. A rake is something simple, it just has teeth. Mine are pretty worn out, so it's not very sharp, but it still does the job. A rake is something that we're literally just gonna put between our handle. This is the safest area, and here. Your handle is always going to be on the opposite side of where the wheel spins. If you were to try raking it from this side, you would do nothing but hit yourself in the face with the rake and get some stitches because the buff will kick it off. So you just figure out what way it spins. After that, you put this handle on this side. This side. Don't mess that one up or it hurts. So anyways, the reason I'm gonna rake this buff is I've used it, and if you look at it in the perfect light, you're gonna start seeing a lot of silver bang up on this thing. That silver is not good, that's caked up rouge. It does add a little extra cut factor, I guess I would say it, but on a lot of our buffs, we wanna make sure we don't cake it. Also, another key thing to buffs, at Renegade, where we get all of our buffs, compound, rakes, everything, you'll notice all of our buffs have an arrow. There's only gonna be one arrow on it. That arrow is the top side of the buff. Every buff has an end to it, and you wanna make sure this end is going to be going with your grinder, not against it, because if it's against it, it's a flap, and it's gonna cause extra scratching that you do not want. So a proficient rake is 3,500 and something like this. And then now we have a clean buff. Typically, I like to start out slow. I don't just hammer the trigger. Variable speed grinders will start up soft if you move it soft. If you just hammer the trigger, it'll just go. So a safety, I tell everyone, when you squeeze this trigger, just go nice and light on it. Let that buff start up and go. Adding rouge, this bar is called the Q69 bar from Renegade. It's one of our newer bars. It's a little greasier. Seems to be something that I like a little better, and I think beginners will too. Helps a lot with hash, and it just seems to be a lot more user-friendly than our drier rouge, which still works incredible in certain situations. So with this, I'm not gonna hold this bar on there like you would your traditional Triple E bar, which is something that you've probably used in the past, and it takes a lot to get the job done. Something like this is just kind of a quick tap. We're gonna start the grinder up, get it full speed. You're gonna see me take the bar. I like to do a simple rule of 1, 2, 3, and then you pull it off. And that buff is fully loaded, and it should get you about a quarter of the way through the wheel, if not halfway. So we're gonna go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And that's about all the rouge we're gonna need in this wheel. Now.
So how often do you rake? Is that like pretty subjective to just what you see on the buff?
Typically on a cut buff, I might rake it once through a wheel.
Okay.
The reason being is with a cut, we don't worry so much about the buff being super fine. Now you like those fibers to be open to hold the rouge, but at the same point, raking is really to keep those fibers split up so they don't cause extra scratching. In a cut, I typically don't worry about there being a lot of hash because that's what my coloring stage or my mid stage is for. Typically, I don't do a color stage. I call it mid because my bar for coloring is still my same exact cut bar, just with a much softer buff. I find this rouge, the Q69 bar, to be a great coloring bar and a great cutting bar because it has great cut to it and a great color to it. It really depends how you're running a buff and what grinder on what this bar is going to decide to do. That's another reason I find this to be so user-friendly because it's just one less bar that you have to remember what it does, where it is, and by. So it's very simple. When we're cutting, you're gonna see me start on a section. We're gonna call it from here to here, if you can see it in that dust, maybe about 10 inches wide. You're gonna see me come in and cut. When I cut, I typically don't like to hold the buff dead straight in the wheel. That's gonna be more of like your finish pass. There's a lot of information to remember, so it does get a little tricky. So with cutting, I just focus on like maybe 15 degrees in, and you're just gonna run this in, and as soon as you hit that 10 inches, on my first pass, I like to go back to where I was, because now this is warm, and then we're gonna warm it up even more. These variable speeds love heat, so do these wheels. You don't wanna sit in just one spot, but you wanna get that heat up, and then I'll come back for a third time, still not adding rouge. The line's gonna be very light, but we're gonna work that heat again. I'm gonna get this whole section cut, and then I'm gonna drift into here, and I'm actually gonna pull back on this wheel and then forward, and then back on this wheel and forward. Reason being is this loves to hold sand marks, as I stated earlier. Same with this area. So to solve both those problems, we're gonna go back and forward here. Before I even start cutting all of that, you're actually gonna see me run this buff right on this edge going in, and that's gonna pull this material and really let the wheel just ride here. The sweet spot on a buff is going to be kind of a diagonal from where you hold your rake. So your rake is against your handle here. So you gotta kind of find that sweet spot. It's one of those things that comes with experience. When you're first starting out, you're gonna kind of run it over, or you're gonna be too far under, and it's gonna pull up. So the biggest key to that is really keeping this back handle low. You don't want it up. If it's up like this, the buff's always gonna wanna run on you. If you keep this hand below this hand, it's gonna be a lot easier to control this buff and just run it on this area real quick here to get that cut nicely. Focus on just that. And then we're gonna focus on our barrel. And then last, we focus on our inside. Once this is heated up, if I was just gonna keep running with it, I wouldn't keep going back and over every 10 inches. I would run out this section, and again, it's hard to describe it all, but I hit this one section here, get this warm. And once this is warm, I run my section, I come right back into my heat. And then I'm gonna really just run my heat another 10 inches and then run that section there. And then I might run out here real quick, get that done, and then I'm gonna run back into here. Again, it's one of those things that, like I said earlier, you kind of find your style and what works for you is a pattern to find. And once you find your pattern, you kind of just keep moving through the wheel. And then if you find sand marks after you do that initial cut, you look at it again, and that's when you might do a second cut. A lot of people cut wheels 2, maybe 3 times on your cut. You really, in my opinion, can't cut a wheel too much. Coloring and finishing is another story, but cutting, you really can't cut too much. That's why I'll go over wheels sometimes 3, 4, 5 times, just looking for that sand mark and that angle. That's why another reason jigs are nice, because you can roll this wheel slow, look at it up top, look at it in the bottom. Sand marks like to hide on you, especially in your cut. But once you hit it with finisher, those sand marks will pop right out. Anyways, that was a lot of information. So let me demonstrate kind of my section here so you can kind of see it. And then you can kind of figure out which way do you want to go about performing what I just did. This buff's already loaded, so you're gonna see me come in here. Let's start with this edge. So we're starting to see that shine come out as soon as I start cutting here. But you're gonna notice this black line. That black line is the rouge that's on this buff getting kicked forward. As a polisher, you're gonna notice you're gonna start getting black as you're buffing. It's actually that rouge kicking off of here. There's always gonna be a little bit of excess rouge that doesn't stick, and it's gonna spray around, especially with these greasy type bars. We call them greasy because of the way the black line moves versus a dry bar isn't gonna create much movement and sling. It's gonna be really just stuck to the buff. It's dry versus a bar that's really wet, and you'll understand it the more you do it. But we're gonna follow that black line. You never wanna jump over it too much. You want just that little 1/4 inch of movement pushing that black line. We're not trying to move that line 1.5 inches up every time. We're trying to just move it 1/4 inch. The tighter your passes are, the better your cut's gonna be, because now you're really focusing that heat and just that little tiny bits. We always kind of wanna lock in at a little angle. We're gonna kind of hold that angle the whole way across here. Very little movements, and you almost lock your shoulders on every pass. And then you're gonna free up and move up. I'll do one pass, sometimes 2, 3 times across here in each movement, just to really ensure that I'm getting that heat, especially in the beginning. I'll really follow this one to build that, and then I might do this one only 2, 3 times, and this one only twice. And once you get rolling, you're rolling. You don't have to go over everything a bunch of times. It's really one of those things of feeling it out. And you're gonna see what you're doing as it comes around here if you keep looking back at it, if you're leaving sand marks or not. So you'll know. Let me go a little more, a little more. But that's a fairly good black line for a greasy rouge. I'll be able to tell you when it starts slimming out. The size of your wheel depends on how much grease is gonna stay, how long it lasts. Like a new buff, I can get halfway around this. A buff that's a little more worn out like this, 9, 8 inches, I might only get to here before it kind of releases it. Sometimes you'll get to here, so there's no like set time on when you're gonna add it. It's kind of just how are you moving it, how much is the wheels, how much is the actual wheel itself soaking up, how much is your buff soaking up, how much are you losing while it's spinning. That's why there's no like direct time on when you're gonna add it. But I'm gonna work the heat up here. We're gonna see me do my section, and we're gonna come back. This is what's gonna make your arms tired. This is where we're putting a good amount of pressure and you can hear that grinder. So this is what's gonna beat your arms up. This is tough. The hardest thing about doing wheels is honestly this outside edge and being able to look from your inside, because I always watch the inside of the buff, and then you have to switch to looking at the outside of the buff to make sure you're not gonna fall off of this. The worst thing you can do is fall off and hit this flange on the edge, because it's gonna put a nice gouge in it. And then you have to sand it out. Not the end of the world, because you can always sand it out. It's aluminum, you can bend it, you can weld it, you can sand it. There's a lot of stuff you can do. Welding it sucks, because there's always porosity. No wheel's a clean blank, technically. But really, it's just exactly what I did there. You saw me on that angle, nice and smooth. Now, if you were gonna start, I like to start just a little bit behind here, and that black line's starting to get a little thin. This wheel absorbed a lot of that rouge, so now I would take this, and I would just give it a little tap. We're just gonna go like this, start smooth. Tap. That's all you need. You're gonna come in, you're gonna start right back here. So you can see all that rouge across there and weird scratches. I'll make a nice black line actually. So I'd start right about there. The back of my buff's here, the front of my buff's there. And we're only gonna move that line up like a 1/4 inch. You don't wanna see that line moving like up to here. You wanna see that just a little bit, little bit. The tighter your lines are, the better your polish is. Another part that sucks is you're on a jig. So these jigs, they wanna spin. So I use my leg against the back here. It's pretty easy for me to do it. Again, it's my skin. I don't know how leggings are gonna work. If it doesn't, I can always just hold it back for you. I can just put a hand right here. I can just hold it for you. Then you just work it. Kind of play with it, figure out what's comfortable for yourself.
Yeah. Get in there and hold it and see what's up.
If you feel out of it, it can go up, I can hold it.
Not looking okay so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
A little more pressure wouldn't be bad.
Okay.
Getting it to just get that little bit of, you'll hear it kind of bog down. It's like letting out the clutch on a car, just that.
The bog down is good.
Yep, you want that little bit of bog.
Should I hit this lip a little further first?
Yep, so now you can run that lip
go
out
underneath
too.
it.
That little angle, just remember the back of the grinder, you want a little lower. Right there is perfect. We're gonna put I call it putting a pattern in it after we go all the way around. Right now, you're really just working out those deep sand marks.
Okay.
After this, we're gonna do a thing where we freeze spin it. We get all the hash perfectly aligned in one way, and it's called, I call it putting a pattern in the aluminum. Okay. You could cut this going from here in if you wanted to. It's just about removing those sand marks.
Okay.
As I said before, you really can't cut too much.
Perfect.
So now we're just working just those sand marks out, then we'll put a pattern. Don't be afraid to add just a little more rouge. That line's getting a little bit light if you look at it. Can't quite see like a black strip growing across. It's like a very light, almost looks like a polished look. So now you can pick up that bar, make sure to lay that grinder flat on your leg and just give it a good little earn.
I'm not doing terrible?
No, not at all. It's all about just that pressure. Keeping that pressure on those little black spots that are binding up. That's just kind of the greasy rouge and honestly the humidity making that compound bind in areas. All that's gonna wipe off very easily with a little bit of the Q16 spray. Those areas, if you do wanna remove them and kind of get on them, you can kind of slow down, focus on them, put pressure. The best way I've always seen sand marks is if you roll it up and kind of look down on the angle or up at it, is when you're gonna see if there's sand marks. And if you're seeing those little squigglies, we call them pigtails from a DA, you're just gonna go over those again, kind of a second cut.
Yeah, I think like from here to here, I need to.
Awesome, so just add a little more rouge to it and go nice and slow, a lot of pressure. Those black spots should pick up or they're gonna spread behind the wheel. Gotcha. Typically they like to kind of go behind the wheel and spread. If they're giving you a hard time and you think they might be affecting it, we can throw a little Q16 hand polish on there and that pulls all that rouge right off.
At this point, should I get more rouge, you think?
You could definitely get more rouge. Sometimes when I get that compound spreading, it kind of will screw up your finish. So I like to take, yeah, all that caking up, I call it, is sometimes from unraked buffs, sometimes from...
Probably uneven pressure even, maybe?
Could be pressure, sometimes it's too much rouge, sometimes it's the temperature and humidity. So to kind of fix that, I'll take this. This is the Q16 spray from Renegade. There's really no, I guess, abrasives in this. There are some, but not much. So I like this for kind of my cleanup stuff. So something like that, I'll take this, shake it up, crack my nozzle, put it on a terry, just a couple spritzes of this. And then I'll take this and I'll just clean all that excess rouge right off there. So then you can kind of run over that real easily. It pulls it right off, no scratching, and kind of helps keep that stuff not caked up on there. You always want to make sure any rag you're wiping on an aluminum wheel is very rich with whatever liquid you're using. Otherwise you'll get a lot of scratching because the abrasives will be left up top and there won't be any lubrication factor. That's what a lot of the watery is kind of a lubrication. And then your grit will be left on top and you'll actually scratch up the wheel. But I'll do that, and I can run it kind of dry. Got a lot of heat in there, I'm getting the heat to the rag, so that's good. Honestly, you're cutting beautifully. There's really not much there for sand marks. A little bit inside, so really it's just pressure. I'll kind of do a little example for you again, just to run over this and clean it up. I'm also gonna rake that for you real quick. Got a good rake in there. I'm gonna take some rouge. I'm gonna get right in here. So that is really my cutting. You can really hear how I'm just pushing into that grinder. A lot of times a hand position will help a lot. So like when I'm doing my first one, really putting a lot of pressure, I really lock my thumb on here. I'm not pushing onto the head, I'm just using my thumb kind of in this groove to kind of push down and make this buff mash down. When it's not running, you can see it's actually pretty flexible just because it's pretty used. But once I get that hot, now I'm using less pressure. I'll use the handle, but I'm still got a decent amount going into the grinder. This will kind of be up. This is pretty loose, and I'm really just resting this arm on here, putting my upper body weight into it and leaning it. And that's what's gonna really cut it and get it so we have almost 0 sand marks here. I might run across that again just to work them again, but that's generally kind of the key to cutting, and it always is kind of a couple processes. You're never just gonna cut it once and be done. There's always that little bit of stuff left in there. So it's like a kind of a multi-step thing. Cutting is the most time-consuming part of polishing.
Because then if you get in and like start to finish it, then you have to start all over with cutting it.
Cutting takes forever. Cutting is the process that I'll spend an hour and a half on a wheel, just cutting. And then my coloring finishing takes me 25, 30 minutes. That's very quick, not even, sometimes 10 minutes.
Kind of like the body work to good paint.
Yep, exactly. The cut is really the second biggest thing. Prep work is the biggest thing. But once you get into kind of a niche with it, you get good at it, you start learning on where a really good prep is, really good finish is. Something like this wheel really would take me about 35 minutes to do it properly, to cut all these spokes nice, and this barrel. Like I said, it comes with time of just learning that heat point, being able to carry it, and then just keep going around and around and around, working that heat consistent. It takes a long time when we're doing kind of like the start, stop, because you're just trying to get that heat worked again and again and again. So it becomes kind of hard to work those sand marks. But if you just stay in it, keep your head down and keep cutting, it just gets easier and easier and easier. But you always got to make sure you got that pressure into it of that real grind. So right here, I'm just gonna run it one more time through this section to get this where it needs to be. Nice and rich on rouge. And then I'm gonna let you pick up again. I'm gonna have a nice thing of rouge right there. You're gonna add a little bit, we're gonna be nice and rich. We're gonna have you put a lot of pressure into it. And I'd love to see you get a section like this of just absolute perfect, of just working it 2-3 times. Get that worked out with that lip too. You did a great job cutting this lip. Right here, you can see just that little bit of sand mark. Sand marks are one thing we look for. They're the little divots in the aluminum. We call them pigtails off a DA. There's the slightest bit. It's really hard for a camera to pick up and really easy to hide on camera. Someone you could think is a great polisher, and those pigtails will still be in there and you'll never see them. Sunlight, if you get it in the perfect angle, you'll find them, especially after a good finish. All right, so that's like the hardest part of polishing to get down, is that cut, that pressure, that deep, rich cut of just moving rouge consistent and getting it to be where this is now pretty much like glass. That would be good to go through with a color or put a pattern in it, as we would do next. But obviously we got to get all the way around the wheel to be putting a pattern in it. Take this grinder, you're going to almost do what we're going to call putting a pattern into a wheel. After powder, let's say you had a little residue, you want to clean it up, you could do almost what I was doing yesterday. If you looked over here, I was kind of just putting a pattern, which is where I get it spinning, and I hold the grinder on an edge, and I'm just slowly working my line in and letting the machine spin the wheel. And then after that, I come with a color, switch my hash direction up, put another pattern in another direction, usually about 2-3 times. That's why I don't use a color rouge, I use my cut bar because you can't cut too much. So using that buff to change the direction, get those little hash lines, which is hashes the micro scratches you'll see in the sun or LED light that a lot of people get kind of scared away from. They see those micro scratches and they think they're messing up, but it's just, that's something that comes from a buff running on it. No matter what, there's some kind of hash from a grinder. It's pretty much virtually impossible to get 0 hash. So then it's just changing those micro scratches, go another direction. Then when we finish, we get them going in our last direction. So you only are picking up that finish hash, that micro, which is where we would just spin it. And that's a much faster process than trying to pull sand marks. Pulling sand marks is actually like refinishing a wheel. So this is more of a video of how to refinish aluminum than straight up just polish. So this is cooled now. So I'm gonna let you take this. I'm gonna have you actually rake this. I tell people you just put the rake, this bottom bolt just a little above here. You're just gonna gently put it into it and let it grab. And then you're just gonna really put it in. It likes to jump. Sometimes they'll kick out of your hand. So you just want a good grip. You're just gonna pushing it right in there. You're gonna rip that buff right up. And after that, the rouge, 1, 2, 3, and you're cooking.
Is that good?
Perfect. Yeah, they get jumpy. I'm gonna say you're definitely getting it. Sounds better.
Sounds
it's
better?
starting to sound a lot more bogged than it did at first. So now I would add just a touch more rouge.
Yeah.
It's about now that you got that pressure figured, now it's figuring out the rouge, and then it's figuring out kind of your flow. You figure out your speed with that rouge, your pattern. Once you get that pressure figured out, now it'll start coming, but you just got to figure out how to keep that pressure easily consistent, which is where I kind of lock my body in and I find that sweet spot and I'll let that wheel rotate where I can just stay in that sweet spot. So how are you feeling about the actual polishing process? I know it can be really frustrating for people to learn.
No, I think besides the pressure, I feel like I understand it. So let's say I can't get as much pressure as you. Will going over it multiple times basically be equivalent or not really?
Yes, so you don't always need all the pressure, but with me I've noticed with the pressure comes the speed and time. It's going to save you a lot of time.
Okay.
Now when there's a tire on it too, it almost seems easier to hold the tire. So now we have this jig locked down. We actually didn't include that, and that's one thing that might make it easier for some people is not having something that's going to free spin. It's just another thing to focus on. We ended up locking this down stationary for her, so now she can focus more in just one area and work it. I've noticed that's worked better for other people that I have taught. But yes, going over it multiple times, eventually you will get there. As long as you're rich on rouge, that light pressure, those sand marks will come out. It's just the heat's gonna build a lot quicker with pressure. It's kind of like cutting steel. If you think about it with a cutting wheel, if you just let a cutting wheel sit there and cut steel, it's kind of slow to go through it.
So I will get there, it'll just take longer.
Yes, exactly.
So basically just keep going over it, a couple more cut passes.
Yeah, really, if you still have sand marks in there, fine, and cut passes. So you got that compound binding up again. So I would just take this, a little bit of the Q16, give it a light spray, and we're just gonna wipe all those marks out of there. So now I'm gonna release that strap. I'm gonna show you how we work it from the outside in, or what I would call is putting a pattern into the barrel. So everything's kind of uniform with hash, so that when we go in and color it, you're not trying to fix lines that are here, here, here,
right.
Here angles. We're gonna put one angle in it, and it's just running that buff on an angle all the way in. And then I like to run this line quite a bit to really make sure you have all those sand marks out of here. Same with here. I really just lock in a position, I hold it, and just slowly drift in the wheel. So Now I'll take you through that, what we call putting in a pattern. It also helps if there's any sand marks. They do come out doing that, but this is what you would more so probably practice in your shop if you were to be trying to polish a wheel. Generally, I feel like you guys aren't dealing with a lot of dings and dents.
Right, yeah, no.
That's
Pretty
what I
much
deal
brand
with.
new wheels that just have a little bit of hazing on them sometimes.
Exactly. For me, my trade of being a polisher, I'm refinishing all the time. But everyone has a different purpose for polishing, so we'll get to that. So now we're gonna come in here, and Lacey did an incredible job at cutting this thing out. She put her senior citizen skills into this, and she was able to get us a pretty decent cut. I wiped this down with a little bit of the Q16 just to get any kind of compound buildup off of this. You don't always need to do that, and you're gonna kind of figure out, the more you experiment with it, how to not get that compound to constantly build up on the wheel. Advice for that, to me, really is gonna be your pressure, and then consistency and movement, learning how to really hold that black line, and having just a smooth surface. This is a smooth surface, but as we know, Lacey's now 30 years old, so it's getting a little tough for her to hold constant pressure on something with those arms.
Carpal tunnel.
The carpal tunnel's just acting up, and it's not treating her well. So anyways, I'm gonna walk her through right now how to put what I call putting a pattern into a wheel. The reason we do that is when you're going doing the back and forth, it's real easy to get some kind of like almost striping pattern to the wheel. We don't like that. On top of that too, your hash, which is those micro scratches from the buff, might be a little inconsistent in their waves. So to kind of help knock down the hash and make it so we don't have those crazy micro scratches in the wheel, we're gonna make sure all of our cut hash is uniform, going in one direction across the barrel of the wheel. Doing so, we're gonna hit this with a quick rake so we have a pretty clean buff. Before I do this, I like to really clean this buff out. So you're gonna see me with a little extra time of raking this buff out. And then I'm gonna add a little rouge to this, and then we're gonna run our line all the way into our valve stem. A lot of times on buffs, you're gonna see me, I kind of go over the top and a little bit under the side. Reason being is when you're polishing, you're never gonna use just the center of this wheel on your surface. Sometimes you get a little lean to it, or a little lean to it, and you want those edges to have that little fray to them too as well. That way they're kind of picking up the rouge, and you don't realize how much this buff really soaks up rouge. Even after if I started cutting right now, I'm gonna get a slight black line because that compound is in this buff. So we're gonna add a little bit. Now this is the hardest part without a tire, is letting it glide and not burning the skin off of your leg. So I'm gonna try to get my shorts on this. I'm gonna let this wheel spin, and I'm gonna start on this outside edge here. I'm gonna have quite a bit of pressure into it, not a ton. And this is probably what I say the hardest part, is to get all these sand marks and keep pressure on this outside edge here and not have the buff fall or go in. You seem to be really good at not letting the buff go over the edge. You were really slick and smooth at keeping it right inside there on the edge, and then back in to the edge and back in. You never really dropped off, so that's a huge positive note to go on. Most people when they start are constantly falling off it, and they're slipping, hitting the asphalt, and yeah, it's not fun. But you did a really good job with that, so I'd be proud of that. So we're gonna give it a slight spin. I'm gonna start it. Add a little more rouge. We want a black line. So sometimes to add rouge when it's spinning on a jig, which our jig is advanced, and this is where it gets a little tricky. I'll have this trigger locked and I hold the body of the grinder. You wanna watch your hands. You don't wanna put them in the buff. You hold the body. I like to kind of feel these brushes with my thumb. This is where the brushes are on the grinder to clean it. And those are the first thing you take apart in your cleaning process. Don't ever mess that up, I do all the time. Hold it there, and I kind of put the handle here, and there's no pressure in it. It's gonna keep the wheel spinning. And I put my bar on in front, and I just tap it, and I let it get a nice line all the way around. It is a little advanced, so if you don't feel comfortable having this running and holding it, you don't feel like you can keep it stable, don't worry about it. You can add it outside, kind of get a line, maybe add a little more, get your line, and then move on from there. This is one that, like, even sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't want to drop that thing. If you drop it, it's going to take off. First thing you do if you ever drop a grinder is you pull the plug. Don't go for the grinder, just pull the plug. It's fine. Black line's complete. Now we're gonna put some pressure into it. no big jumps. It's very slow. So that's how we get uniform hash. Now, if you get your camera on the perfect angle here with the light from back here, you actually might be able to pick it up. As I spin this, you can see all these little micro scratches. I don't know if the camera picks it up well. It's very hard to, but these micro scratches are now all going in. Everything's uniform, and it's the exact same line all the way into that barrel. So now it's a lot easier for us to remove that hash. The number one reason I use my same cut bar, and I love this bar has a lot of coloring in it, but it also cuts great. So now I can run my color buff, which is going to be a 40 ply flannel, which is a pretty soft buff, but when you put the right rouge on, a lot of pressure, it'll cut too. It just cuts very slow. It's very soft. You'll see it's a big fluffy pad. With that one, I'm now going to start in here with it. I'm going to add all my rouge, get this nice and black, and you're going to see I'm going to change my angle out. And now I'm going to be making sure that I don't see anything going this way. It's just coming out, and it's a very soft buff, so it's not going to be this deep hash. This is what I would consider a deep hash. Like in the sunlight, natural light, you would see this from a mile away. I'd look at this wheel and go, whoa, who did that? Like, not good. But with that buff, it's going to be a lot lighter. So then our finish pad, which is a very soft buff, we're going to focus with that one on just pulling it out. And you're going to notice with a finish buff, I don't use a lot of rouge, which is very different. A lot of polishers are big on putting a lot of rouge on there and blackening it up. But that finish bar burns very easy. And when you burn a wheel, you're never going to burn the aluminum. You're going to burn the compound. The bar will turn brown or white. And that's what I call a compound burn, which is very easy to remove using acid or just a quick sand. But obviously, as you see with sanding, it's tough to pull sand marks. All right, so here, same grinder, 849X. I got a whole bunch of these. I love these. Now we're gonna be going into our color or our mid-stage process. This is gonna be a 40 ply flannel from Renegade. You can use a lot of different buffs to do your color or mid-stage, like a UBM, a purple, any kind of softer buff than a red, orange, or a yellow is great for coloring, in my opinion. Again, polishing all comes down to opinions and what works for you. For me, these 40 plies I think are incredible for my coloring stage. Some guys like to finish with these. I personally like coloring with these. Every once in a while I'll get a finish out of these. These, to attach them, I usually run an extension. This is a 3-inch extension with a grinder nut on it. That's how you attach these to a grinder. You could get it on the shaft here, but when it's on a shaft, it tends to rub the grinder a lot, and it'll actually get your fingers when your fingers are on here. So I like it a little farther away, and it does make leverage with pressure a little bit harder, but there's not a lot of pressure involved in this. The hardest thing with these buffs is raking them. These love to grab a rake and go when it's far from the handle. It's actually a little difficult to do it. I like to run these around 2200, but for anyone starting out polishing, if you're ever gonna rake a finish buff or even a 40 ply, I recommend you just turn your grinder down a little bit so it's easier for you. 1400 generally seems to be a good RPM to make it so you're not gonna hurt your wrist or maybe hurt your fingers. Fingers are a big thing with these rakes to watch. I typically hold the rake by the edges here really tight. For anyone starting out, I recommend you hold it by the end until you get really comfortable with the pressures and how it pulls. So I'm gonna do it by the end. For a finish buff, I don't turn it on. I start here and I just bump this trigger, get it in, and just hold it. It looks very easy, but it does grab very quick. That's why we turn the RPMs down. When you get into your coloring buffs and your finish buffs, it's very important to keep them raked. You don't want any compound binding up in here because now we're trying to minimize the hash. We're not looking to bring out any kind of sand marks or take those out. The sand marks are completely out of this wheel. We're just looking to change the hash. We're looking to make it very, very little hash, and maybe a little bit of the clarity is gonna pop a little bit more to this wheel. But with this bar, our clarity is really put into it with our cut, which is not like a lot of other bars. If you were to use something drier like our T121 Triple E or any Triple E based bar, you're not gonna get a lot of pop out of your cut. You get your pop from your color. That's why I call this a mid-stage versus color. We're gonna take our bar, add a little bit on the buff. Now we have a nice layer of polish on here. I'm going to actually coat the wheel before I do this. I do just a little bit of the Q16 spray to help with the coloring process. Also lubrication, getting the hash out. Another big benefit to doing this is it's very easy to see where you are. This buff's not gonna put out that real thick black line that we would get from our cutting stage. This is gonna be kind of a really thin black line that's sometimes hard to keep track of. Even as a professional, it's very easy to lose track of where you were. So now we're gonna get this buff spinning in here, bump this back up to about 2400, 2200, 2600. It's kind of a range, wherever you feel comfortable. I'm running at 24. We're gonna turn this on. I'm gonna bump this wheel. We're gonna get spinning, and then I'm gonna add a little bit of rouge in here, once around. Then you're gonna see me working it out. I turn this grinder on a little angle. I like my hands on the head again, because if my hands bump this wheel, they're not necessarily gonna scratch it. If you have this rubber and plastic grinding against the wheel, you're gonna be adding scratches. So I put my hand below this, and we let the grinder just do the work, very, very slow, and you try to keep the wheel spinning as consistent as possible if you have a jig. When we get to our outer edge, you always wanna straighten out the buff. The softer the buff is, the more it's gonna wanna grab and run on you. When the harder the buff is, it doesn't want to grab as bad, but when they're soft, they catch anything they can and they go. So now when I'm looking at this wheel, I'm looking for anything that might be Xing. If there's an X, I simply know I just got to run from the inside out again, and then that's just pulling out more hash and getting it perfect. Right now I'm looking at this, and honestly, I'm not seeing anything going in, so I know I did it a perfect color stage or mid stage. Generally, you can get it in one shot, sometimes two. As you can see, it's really not a lot of pressure. It's really just consistent, letting it spin, having the buff making contact, enough rouge, the spray, and it just works like art. This is, again, a little advanced for people to learn. A lot of people will start out just running straight, but if you're looking for that perfect polish, Lacey, the old lady, is getting the complete in-depth to perfection polish right now.
Senior citizen course.
This is how you get it perfect, in my opinion. All right, so for our final step and our final finish on polishing, I definitely do it a little different than some guys, so everyone has an opinion on it. Again, this is how I like to do it for my best results. Again, I take this Q16 spray. All I'm gonna do is literally open it, and then I'm just gonna spritz it all over the wheel. After that, I'm gonna let that sit there. I'm gonna take my Finish Buff, which is a double stack cotton flannel from Renegade on their double stack flanges. This is my favorite finish. I'll turn this down again, 1400 for the beginners. If you're advanced, you know how to hold the rake and everything, you can rake it at full speed, but I'll rake it at 1400. Some little silver tips in here. We wanna break this buff up, make sure it's nice and fluffy. Sometimes for some people, they'll use sandpaper, sometimes they'll use stones. Me, I'm okay with my rakes because they're very worn out. Here, I'll turn this back up around 2000 RPMs. My new finish bar of choice is this blue from Renegade. This is not the lighter blue that we use on stainless. This is a much darker blue. It's like a blueberry bar. This, we're gonna take it, since it's so wide, from our inside, move it all the way to the out, and I'm not gonna use a lot. You're gonna notice it's very quick. I don't like using a lot of the bar on it. I like using more of the spray, and that's what I use for my finish. This is just that little bit of grit to help get that hash where we need it. So now we're gonna take it. It's a very quick process. You can see the tint of blue on the buff. You don't want a caked blue buff. You want a tint of your color across your wheel here. So now, very similar to my coloring process, you're gonna see me put a spin on this wheel. Instead of me tilting the buff in an angle like we did cutting, or an angle like we did on our color, I'm just gonna hold this straight. I'm not gonna have any pressure applied here. I'm just gonna almost be holding the weight of the grinder, letting the buff put the pattern into the wheel. It's just enough where this buff is gonna press just enough to rub the wheel. We're not going for any kind of anything other than straightening out those micro scratches and getting a perfect line of hash that's actually gonna be vertical in the wheel. I feel like that's the hardest hash pattern to pick up with the eye, if that makes any sense. Being a polisher is really, it's kind of an art of hiding the hash, figuring out how to do it, like when it comes to flat panels and wheels. It's about trying to make it so it's diminished enough where you're not gonna pick it up the second you look at a wheel. The way I found best is vertical on this wheel. Some guys you'll see do angles out, some angle in. Personally, I like the straight. So we're gonna give it a good spin and get this started. So that is how we get what I would call a professional polish on a wheel with the most minimal hash we could possibly get. That's your simple wheel polish that honestly any customer is going to be absolutely thrilled with. There's a lot of clarity in that wheel, no sand marks, minimal hash, and honestly a gorgeous shine. And now Miss Lacey Blair can polish every customer's wheels that come to her shop.
No, I don't know about that.
This was really fun. I'm ready to go back to powder coating tomorrow though.
You don't think this is a trade for you? You don't think you would enjoy this every day?
Not every day, no. All right, y'all. If you like this video, go follow Jake. He has a YouTube channel also. Definitely follow him on TikTok. And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. And we'll see you next time.